The sound came first. Scrub brush on stone, back and forth. A rhythm like a heartbeat steady and deliberate in the pre-dawn silence of the broken tusk tavern. The kind of sound that
Busy night
fills
for you,
empty
cleaner?
spaces and
Aye,
asks
my lady.
nothing in return.
Someone's got to do it.
Then the
True
smell.
enough.
Pine soap cut with
Enough.
something
We have more
sharper,
pressing
something
matters.
chemical
Yes, my
that
lady.
burned the back of the throat if you breathe it in too deep. Mixed underneath the ghost of last night's ale, the tang of spilled beer that had soaked into wood grain over decades and would never fully wash away, no matter how hard a man scrubbed. And finally, the mystery. Why did the most powerful woman in Iron Peak spend 6 weeks watching a janitor work? But that came later. Right now, at 5 in the morning with frost still clinging to the windows and the first pale light barely touching the peaks of the Stormcrest Mountains, there was only Callum Wright in the floor he was cleaning and the sound of his own breathing in the dark. He'd been at it for an hour already, started at the back of the main hall and worked his way forward in long, methodical strokes the way he always did. Never missed a section, never cut corners. The bucket beside him held water gone gray with dirt, and his knees ached from the cold stone, and his shoulders burned from the repetitive motion. But his hands were steady. They were always steady when he worked. It was only when they were empty that they shook. Callum sat back on his heels and wiped his forearm across his forehead. Sweat despite the cold. The stain he'd been working on for the past 20 minutes was finally lifting. Dark ale from the eastern foothills, someone had said. Thad's crew, probably. They'd been celebrating something the night before. Broken 2 chairs in the process. Carved something obscene into one of the tables. He'd already swept up the chair pieces and stacked them by the door for firewood. Already sanded down the carving until it was just a smooth depression in the wood that could have been anything. Could have been nothing. That was the job. Make the mess disappear. Make it like it never happened. Behind him, the kitchen door swung open with a creak that echoed through the empty hall. You're early again. Maris, the head cook, 60-something years old, built like a barrel with green skin, weathered by decades of heat and steam, and the kind of hard work that bent spines and thickened knuckles. She carried a steaming mug in each hand, moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste energy on unnecessary motions. Morning, Maris. Callum didn't look up, kept scrubbing. By 15 minutes, she set one mug down beside his bucket. Coffee from the smell, strong and bitter, and exactly what he needed. Every day this week, 15 minutes early. Couldn't sleep. Uh-huh. She stood there for a moment longer watching him work. Callum could feel her eyes on the back of his neck. Maris had a way of looking at people that made them want to confess things. He'd seen her reduce grown orcs to stammering children with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and strategic silence. Main hall's a disaster, she said finally. Thad and his crew came through after midnight. You'll be here all morning. Figured. I'll have breakfast ready when you're done with this section. Appreciate it. She walked away without another word, her footsteps heavy on the stone. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, and Callum was alone again with the scrub brush and the stain and the sound of his own breathing. He picked up the coffee, held the mug in both hands and brought it to his lips. The heat felt good against his palms. The bitter taste cut through the chemical burn in his throat. His hands shook, just a tremor, small enough that most people wouldn't notice. But Callum noticed. He always noticed. He set the mug down carefully, made sure it was stable on the uneven floor, then picked up the scrub brush again. Steady, always steady when he worked. The stain came up in pieces, dark streaks that loosened and dissolved and swirled into the gray water of his bucket. He'd need fresh water soon. Need to dump this batch out back, refill from the pump, add more of the harsh soap that Maris kept in an unmarked brown jug beneath the lowest shelf. 4 months he'd been doing this. 4 months of arriving before dawn and leaving after dark. 4 months of scrubbing floors and wiping tables and hauling trash and fixing whatever broke during the previous night's chaos. 4 months of being invisible. That was fine. Invisible was what he'd come here for. Callum Wright had been other things before he'd been a janitor. Better things, people would say. More important things. He'd been a paramedic in Denver for 8 years, responded to calls, saved lives, wore the uniform and carried the bag and knew exactly what to do when someone's heart stopped, or their lungs filled with blood, or the world decided it was their turn to stop being alive, until the day he'd hesitated. 3 seconds. That was all it took. 3 seconds of standing outside the overturned truck, watching the gasoline pool on the asphalt, listening to the young man trapped inside calling for help and calculating the odds. 3 seconds of being professional instead of brave. 3 seconds of doing exactly what his training said to do. Assess the situation, wait for fire support. Don't become a victim yourself. 3 seconds while a spark from somewhere found the gasoline and turned the world into fire. The young man's name had been Tyler Morrison, 23 years old, musician, drove too fast on mountain roads and paid for it when his truck went off the shoulder and rolled 3 times before coming to rest on its side. He'd still been alive when Callum arrived, still conscious, still calling for help. He wasn't alive when the fire burned out. The investigation cleared Callum of any wrongdoing. Protocol had been followed. No one could have predicted the spark. No one could have pulled Morrison out in time even if they'd tried. The gasoline ignition was ruled accidental, unavoidable. But Callum's hands had started shaking anyway, started shaking and never quite stopped. He'd left Denver 3 months after that, left the job, left his apartment, left everything that reminded him of who he used to be. Drove north and west until he ran out of road, found himself in Iron Peak, a mountain town where humans were rare and questions were rarer, and took the first job that didn't ask him to save anyone. Scrubbing floors didn't require steady hands, just steady effort. He finished with the stain and stood lifting the bucket. His knees cracked. His back protested. 52 years old, and he felt every one of them in the morning. The bucket was heavy, sloshing with dirty water, and he carried it through the kitchen to the back door. The cold hit him like a fist when he stepped outside. Late autumn and the storm crests and winter was coming early. Frost covered everything. The drainage ditch behind the tavern steamed when he dumped the gray water into it, minerals and soap mixing with the constant trickle of snowmelt that ran down from the peaks. He stood there for a moment, breathing the clean air. Let it burn his lungs. Let it clear his head. Inside, through the kitchen window, he could see Maris moving around the stove, could smell bacon starting to sizzle. His stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten since yesterday noon, but there was still work to do. Callum refilled the bucket from the pump, his breath visible in the pre-dawn cold, added the harsh soap from the brown jug, carried it back into the main hall, and started on the next section. The Broken Tusk was one of 3 taverns in Iron Peak, but it was the largest, the oldest, built from mountain stone and timber cut from the old growth forests that used to cover these slopes before the mines opened up. The main hall could hold 100 people when it was packed with heavy wooden tables scarred by decades of use and a fireplace large enough to roast a whole pig. The ceiling beamed with rough-cut logs that still had bark on them in places. It was the kind of place that had stories in its bones, the kind of place where generations of miners and traders and soldiers had gathered to drink and argue and celebrate and mourn, where deals were made and broken, where reputations rose and fell with the tides of gossip and rumor. Callum had learned all of this in his 4 months here. Learned it by listening while he worked, by being invisible and ignored and present for every conversation that assumed he wasn't worth noticing. He knew that old Ronan who sat in the corner booth every Thursday had lost his son in a mine collapse 15 years ago and still ordered 2 ales every time. Knew that the tall orc woman with a scar on her jaw had been a soldier in the clan wars and still flinched at loud noises. Knew that Ironjaw who made the most mess and the loudest noise was trying to prove something to a father who'd never thought he was good enough. Callum knew all of this, and no one knew anything about him. That was exactly how he wanted it. The sun was starting to rise by the time he finished the floor. Pale gold light slanted through the high windows and painted long rectangles across the stone he'd just scrubbed clean. He stood and surveyed his work with the critical eye of someone who'd learned that details mattered. No stains, no debris. The wood of the tables gleamed where he'd wiped them down. The broken chair pieces were stacked neatly for the fire. The Broken Tusk looked like nothing had happened here the night before. "Breakfast is ready," Maris called from the kitchen. Callum washed his hands at the pump, scrubbing away the chemical smell of the soap, then headed into the kitchen. The warmth hit him immediately. Maris had a plate waiting. Eggs, bacon, thick slices of dark bread toasted over the stove. "You eat," she said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. "Then you fix the table in the corner." Legs wobbling again. "Already noticed it." "Course you did." He ate standing up, too tired to sit. The food was simple and good, and he didn't taste much of it. Just fuel, just something to keep him going. When he was done, he took his tools from the storage room. A small box of wood screws, a screwdriver, a piece of sandpaper. The table in the corner had been wobbling for weeks. One of the legs was cracked near the bottom stress from years of being pushed and pulled and leaned on. He could have mentioned it to someone, could have asked for replacement materials, could have made it someone else's problem. Instead, he just fixed it. Callum worked carefully, quietly, reinforced the crack with a thin piece of scrap wood he'd saved from the broken chairs, glued it, screwed it, sanded it smooth so no one would catch splinters. By the time he was done, the table didn't wobble anymore. It would hold for another few years at least. No one would notice, no one would thank him. That was fine. The morning stretched on. Maris worked in the kitchen preparing food for the day's service. Callum moved through his list of tasks, wiped down the bar, checked the lanterns for oil, swept the front steps. Small things, necessary things. The kind of work that held a place together without anyone realizing it was happening. His hands were steady the entire time. It was only when he stopped, when he stood still with nothing to do and nowhere to put his energy. That's when the tremor came back. That's when he could feel Tyler Morrison's ghost watching him from the corners of empty rooms. Could still hear the screaming that turned to silence when the flames took hold. 3 seconds. That's all it took for everything to change. By noon, the Broken Tusk was starting to wake up. Early patrons filtering in, miners coming off night shifts, traders looking for lunch and information, the noise level rising gradually from the morning silence. Callum kept to the edges, kept working, kept invisible. He was on his knees again this time, working on a scuff mark near the fireplace when he heard Maris call his name from the kitchen. "Right, you got a minute." He stood, joints protesting, and headed back to the kitchen. Maris was pulling a massive pot off of the stove, her face flushed from the heat. "What do you need?" "Storage room upstairs, second door on the left. There's a crate of preserved vegetables I need brought down. Can you handle it?" "Sure." He climbed the narrow stairs at the back of the kitchen. The second floor of the Broken Tusk was mostly storage and a few small rooms that Maris rented out when travelers needed somewhere to stay. The hallway was dim lit only by a single window at the far end. Second door on the left, Callum found the crate. Heavy. His shoulders protested when he lifted it, but he managed. Started back down the stairs, moving carefully. One step at a time. The weight shifting with each movement. Halfway down, his hands started to shake. Just a tremor. Just enough to make the crate wobble. Just enough to remind him that some things couldn't be fixed by working harder. He made it to the bottom. Set the crate down. Took a breath. His hands were steady again. "Good, Taras," Maris said, already pulling vegetables from the crate. "Now get out of my kitchen. Lunch rush is coming, and I don't need you underfoot." Callum went back to the main hall, back to his bucket and brush, back to the work that never quite ended. The afternoon passed in its familiar rhythm. Lunch service brought more people, more noise, more mess. Callum moved through it like water cleaning around conversations invisible to everyone who mattered. Thad Ironjaw came in around 2. Big orc, mid-30s, built like he spent his days hauling ore and his nights looking for fights. He had 3 others with him, his crew. They took the table near the fireplace. The best table. The one they always took. They ordered ale and meat and made sure everyone in the tavern knew they were there. Loud, boisterous, taking up space like it was their right. Callum cleaned tables on the other side of the room, kept his head down, kept working. "Hey, human." He didn't look up. Thad wasn't talking to him. Thad never talked to him directly. Thad talked at him, talked around him, talked like he was part of the furniture. "You think he understands common, or is he just pretending?" Laughter from Thad's crew. Callum kept wiping down the table, back and forth, methodical, steady. Probably pretending. Humans are good at that, pretending they're people. More laughter. Callum moved to the next table. This one had a ring from a wet mug, the kind of stain that set if you left it too long. He scrubbed at it carefully, patient. By the time the sun started setting, Callum had been working for nearly 14 hours. His knees ached, his back ached, his hands were raw from the harsh soap, but the Broken Tusk was clean, ready for the evening crowd. Maris brought him dinner in the kitchen. Stew and bread. He ate it standing up again, too tired to care about taste. "You should go home," she said. "Soon." "You say that every night." "Tonight I mean it." She snorted. Didn't believe him. Neither did he. The evening crowd started arriving around 6. Different from the lunch crowd, more miners, more soldiers, more people looking to forget whatever they'd been doing during the day. The noise level rose. The tavern filled with the smell of ale and smoke, and too many bodies in too small a space. Callum worked the edges, collecting empty mugs, wiping spills before they became stains. Invisible. And then at 7 o'clock exactly the front door opened. The room changed. Not silent, not dramatic, just different. Conversations that had been loud became quieter, more measured. Men who'd been sprawling in their chairs sat up straighter. The laughter that filled the space took on a different quality, still present but aware, watchful. She walked in like she owned the place. Tall, powerfully built, blue skin that marked her clan, black hair and dozens of thin braids that fell past her shoulders. Dark leather armor, well-made functional. No weapon visible, but something in the way she moved suggested she was never truly unarmed. Kira Stormhold, chieftain of the Iron Peak Orc clan, daughter of Chief Magnus. The woman who would lead 3 of the 5 mountain territories when her father stepped down. She crossed to her usual table, the one near the window with good sight lines to both doors. Sat down with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had reason to doubt that the world would arrange itself appropriately around her. Someone rushed to bring her wine. Dark wine from the eastern valleys. She took it without thanks. Not rude, just accustomed. Callum was on his knees near the fireplace collecting debris that Thad's crew had kicked under the table. Broken nutshells, bones from their dinner. The kind of mess that accumulated when people stopped caring about where things landed. He could feel her eyes on him. At first he thought he was imagining it, the particular sensation of being watched. But when he glanced up just for a second, he caught her gaze across the crowded room. She was looking directly at him, not past him, not through him, at him. Her dark eyes were steady and calm and completely unreadable. He looked away first, went back to collecting the debris. His heart was beating faster than it should. His hands wanted to shake, but he wouldn't let them. When he glanced up again a few minutes later, she was looking at the room at large, watching the crowd with that same steady attention. He'd imagined it, obviously, but it happened again the next evening, and the evening after that, and the one after that. For 6 weeks, Kira Stormhold came to the Broken Tusk every night at 7 o'clock, sat at her usual table, drank her dark wine, and watched Callum Wright scrub floors like it was the most interesting thing in the world. 6 weeks. That's how long it took for Callum Wright to understand that he wasn't imagining it, that Kira Stormhold, chieftain of the Iron Peak Orc clan, was deliberately, consistently, impossibly watching him work. Not every moment, not even most moments, but enough that he'd started to feel her attention like weight on his shoulders. Enough that his movements changed when she was in the room. More careful, more precise, like he was being evaluated and didn't know the criteria. It happened in patterns. 7 o'clock every evening. The front door would open and the tavern would shift, voices lowering, postures straightening. That collective adjustment that happened when power walked into a room and demanded acknowledgement without saying a word. She crossed to her usual table, the one by the window. Dark wine would appear before she asked for it, and then she'd settle into her chair with that easy confidence and let her gaze drift across the room. And inevitably, eventually, it would land on him. Callum on his knees scrubbing, Callum wiping tables, Callum moving through the evening crowd with his bucket and his brush and his careful invisibility that was somehow no longer working. He tried not to look back, tried to focus on his work, but the human eye is drawn to what watches it, and more than once he glanced up to find her still there, still watching, those dark eyes calm and steady and giving nothing away. It made him nervous, made him wonder what she saw, made him check his work twice, 3 times looking for flaws. But it also made him stand a little straighter. The 3rd week he dropped his bucket. Stupid mistake. He'd been carrying it from the kitchen, threading through the evening crowd, and someone moved when he didn't expect it. The bucket tilted, water sloshed over the rim. He tried to correct, overcorrected, and the whole thing went down. Gray, soapy water spreading across the clean floor he'd spent all afternoon scrubbing. The bucket rolling. The crowd nearest him jerking back with curses and complaints. Callum stood there frozen, watching his work literally wash away, feeling every eye in the tavern turn toward the commotion. And then he heard it. Laughter, not the cruel kind, Not the mocking kind that Thad and his crew specialized in. This was different, quieter, almost surprised, like the person laughing had forgotten what the sound felt like coming out of their throat. He looked up. Kira Stormhold was laughing, one hand covering her mouth but not quite hiding the smile, her shoulders shaking slightly with the effort of keeping it contained, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like delight. The entire tavern had gone quiet, staring, because no one had ever seen Kira Stormhold laugh before. No one had ever seen her smile like that. She was the chieftain. She was power and authority and careful control. She didn't laugh at spilled water in taverns, but she was laughing now. And she was looking at Callum while she did it. The moment stretched, hung in the air like smoke. And then Kira composed herself, took a sip of her wine, returned her attention to the room at large like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Callum felt it in his chest, felt it in the way his hands didn't shake when he bent to retrieve the bucket, felt it in the strange warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. He cleaned up the spill, refilled the bucket, went back to work. And when he glanced towards her table again, she wasn't watching him anymore. But he could have sworn she was still smiling. That night, Maris caught him in the kitchen after closing. "She laughed at you," Maris said, not a question. "At the situation." "Uh-huh." Maris was wiping down her knives, each stroke deliberate. "You know what people are saying? I don't pay attention to what people say." "Maybe you should start." Callum didn't answer, just picked up his coat from the hook by the door. "Be careful, right?" Maris's voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "She's not like other people. The weight she carries, it doesn't leave room for certain kinds of attachments. I'm just cleaning her floors. You keep telling yourself that." He walked home through the cold mountain night, his small room above the general store, one window looking out at the peaks, a bed, a chair, a lamp. Everything he owned in the world fit in a single canvas bag under Bowen. He lay awake for a long time, thinking about laughter, about dark eyes watching him work, about the strange feeling in his chest that wouldn't quite settle. His hands didn't shake that night. The pattern continued. Days blended together in the familiar rhythm of work. Dawn to dusk, scrubbing and fixing and cleaning, making the mess disappear, making it like nothing had happened, but something had changed. Callum was aware of her now, not just aware that she watched, aware of her, the way she moved through space with that careful economy, the way she listened when people spoke, giving them her full attention like their words actually mattered. The way she looked at things, really looked, noticing details that others missed. He saw her watching the old orc couple in the corner booth one Thursday. They'd been coming in for years, Ronan had told him. Same table, same meal, same argument every single week. Most people ignored them. Kira watched them like they were the most interesting thing in the room. He saw her watching the stray cat that lived in the tavern's rafters, the orange tabby that hunted mice at night and dozed by the fire during the day. Saw her slip it a piece of meat from her plate when she thought no one was looking. He saw her watching him, and he started watching back. Not obviously, not directly, but in the spaces between tasks. In the moments when he could justify a glance, learning the architecture of her face, the line of her jaw, the way her mouth curved when someone said something she found clever, the small scar above her left eyebrow that was barely visible unless the light hit it right. 4 weeks became 5. 5 became 6. And then on a cold morning in late autumn, everything changed. Callum was alone in the main hall. 5 in the morning, the sun not yet up. Working on a stain that had been resisting his efforts for 2 days straight. Dark ale ground into the grain of the wood. The kind of stain that required patience and persistence and the willingness to scrub the same spot 100 times until it finally surrendered. He was on his knees, brush in hand, completely focused. The front door opened. Unusual. The tavern didn't open for hours. Deliveries came through the back. And the only people who had keys were Maris and the owner, and neither of them had reason to be here this early. Callum looked up. Kira Stormhold stood in the doorway. Alone, no guards, no soldiers, no formal armor. She wore simple dark trousers and a deep green tunic. Her braids were loose around her shoulders. In the pre-dawn light, she looked younger, less like a chieftain and more like a woman. She closed the door behind her, crossed the empty tavern. Her footsteps quiet on the stone floor he'd spent all night scrubbing. She stopped a few feet away from him, looked down at where he knelt, looked at the stubborn stain he'd been fighting. "You're always here," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, deeper, the kind of voice that carried authority without trying. Callum sat back on his heels, set down his brush. His heart was doing something complicated in his chest. "Most mornings," he said, she was quiet for a moment, just looking at him. And he was looking back, and the tavern was empty and silent around them, and this felt important in a way he couldn't quite name. "Why do you stay?" she asked. "You're human, far from human lands. You work harder than anyone in this building for less reward than anyone in this building. Most of the people here treat you like you're part of the furniture. Why do you stay?" Yeah. It was a more perceptive question than he'd expected, a more personal one. Callum could have deflected, could have given her some easy answer about work being hard to find, about the roads south being dangerous in winter. All of those things were true. None of them were the real answer. "I'm not ready to go back yet," he said instead. "And this place doesn't ask me about my past. That's worth something." Kira considered this, her dark eyes steady on his face, reading him the way she read everything, looking for the truth underneath the words. "My father's men talk about you," she said, "the ones who come here regularly." Callum said nothing, waited. "They say you're pathetic." Her tone was completely neutral. Not cruel, not kind, just factual. A human doing orc servant work for orc servant wages. They find it funny. Some of them make a point of making extra mess when they know you'll be here to clean it up. "I know," Callum said. "It doesn't make you angry." He thought about this honestly, about Thad and his crew, about the deliberate spills and the carved obscenities and the loud commentary designed to humiliate, about 3 seconds of hesitation while Tyler Morrison burned, about the sound of screaming that turned to silence. "It used to," he said. "Now I mostly just see it as extra work." Something moved in Kira's expression, something quick and complicated, gone before he could read it fully. "You have more dignity than they do," she said quietly. "They mock a man for working. You work without mocking anyone." She paused. The silence stretched. "I've been watching you, Callum Wright." The sound of his name in her mouth did something to him. She knew his name. She'd learned his name. She'd been watching him long enough to know who he was. "I know," he said, quieter now. She looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in her eyes that he recognized, something he'd seen in his own reflection in the dark hours of the morning when sleep wouldn't come. Loneliness, the kind that came from being seen as a thing instead of a person, from having every interaction filtered through expectation and hierarchy and careful performance. She was the chieftain. She carried the weight of leadership, and no one had made her laugh in years, until he dropped a bucket of soapy water. "The stain will come out easier if you mix a little river ash into the solution," Kira said, not looking at the stain, looking at him. "Maris keeps it by the kitchen door, for the cooking pots." Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. She paused at the door, hand on the frame, looked back over her shoulder. "I'll see you tonight, Callum Wright." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click. Callum knelt there on the cold stone floor, his brush forgotten in his hand, his heart doing that complicated thing again, the warmth in his chest spreading like fire. She knew his name. She'd been watching him. She saw him. He picked up the brush, went back to work, but his hands didn't shake for the rest of the day. Word traveled fast in a small mountain town, and in a tavern it traveled faster still. By evening, when the regular crowd started filtering in for their nightly rituals, something had changed in the atmosphere. Callum felt it the moment he stepped into the main hall with his bucket and brush, eyes following him, conversations pausing when he passed. The particular quality of attention that came when people were talking about you while pretending not to. Thad Ironjaw had seen Kira leaving the tavern that morning. Must have. Or maybe someone else had seen and told him. Either way, the information had spread, mutated, grown in the telling. Kira Stormhold, chieftain of Iron Peak, had come to the tavern specifically to speak with the human janitor, the poorest man in the building, the most invisible man in the building. And now everyone was watching to see what it meant. Callum kept his head down, kept working, Wiped tables, collected empty mugs, swept debris into neat piles. The familiar routine that usually made him invisible. But invisible wasn't working anymore. He could feel the weight of their attention, could hear the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough, could see the way Thad's crew kept glancing at him and then away like they were working up to something. 7 o'clock came. The door opened, the tavern shifted, and Kira Stormhole walked in with two of her father's soldiers flanking her at a respectful distance. She crossed to her usual table, the one by the window. Dark wine appeared, she settled into her chair, and her gaze found Callum immediately. He was on his knees near the fireplace, picking up bones and scraps that Thad's crew had kicked under the table. The kind of work that required him to be small, to be low, to be beneath notice. But Kira noticed. She watched him work with that steady attention, and this time she didn't look away, didn't pretend to be looking at something else, just watched him openly, deliberately, claiming the watching. Thad saw it. Of course he saw it. Thad was watching both of them with the focused attention of someone who'd decided this situation was personally offensive. Must be nice, Thad said, loud enough to be heard at several neighboring tables. To have the chieftain feeling sorry for the floor scrubber. The tables nearby went quiet. Callum continued collecting scraps, methodically, without looking up. Maybe she feels guilty, one of Thad's crew offered. The stocky one whose name Callum had never bothered to learn. Her father's men keep making the mess bigger. Maybe she thinks the human will collapse from exhaustion. Laughter from the near tables, not the whole tavern. Old Ronan and a few others kept their expressions carefully neutral, but enough laughter to fill the space, to make the mockery complete. Or maybe, Thad said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his massive arms, she's never seen anything so pathetic that it crossed back around into being interesting, like a three-legged dog. You feel sorry for it, but you also can't stop looking at it. More laughter, louder now. Callum stood, slowly, his hands full of bones and food scraps. Walked to the waste bucket by the bar, deposited them, turned back to continue his work. And then Kira spoke. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. There was something in the quality of it when she chose to project. Not volume exactly, weight, density, like the words had more substance than ordinary words, like they could cut through noise the way a knife cuts through cloth. Thaddeus, the laughter stopped. Thad's chair legs came down from their tilt and hit the floor with a dull thud. He turned in his seat, slowly, with the exaggerated casualness of someone who very much wanted to appear unbothered. Chieftain, he said, his tone walking the fine line between respect and mockery. Kira set down her wineglass, stood. The entire tavern went silent, watching. She didn't walk toward Thad, didn't need to, just stood there at her table and let her voice carry across the space between them. That man, she said, and she didn't gesture toward Callum, but everyone knew exactly who she meant, has been in this building since before sunrise. He has cleaned what you dirtied. He has repaired what you broke. He has worked every hour without complaint and without recognition in the service of a place that treats him as furniture. Her voice was perfectly level, perfectly calm, but there was steel underneath, a core of something harder than iron. You, she continued, her dark eyes fixed on Thad, have sat in that chair for 4 hours. You have consumed approximately 3 days of his wages in ale, and the only thing you have produced in that time is noise mess and the spectacle of a large man choosing a small target. Thad's jaw was tight, his hands clenched on the table. The tavern was so quiet that Callum could hear the fire crackling, could hear his own heartbeat. I'm not telling you to respect him, Kira said. And there was something in her tone now that was harder than anything she'd said before. Something absolute. I'm observing that you have chosen to perform your contempt for him loudly in front of a room full of people, which tells me that the contempt is not really about him at all. She picked up her wineglass, took a measured sip. It never is. The silence held for another heartbeat. 2, 3. Then Kira sat back down, returned her attention to her wine. The conversation was over. Thad stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he picked up his own mug and drank in silence. Nobody at Thad's table said anything else about Callum for the rest of the evening. Callum stood there, his hands full of cleaning supplies, his heart doing something he couldn't quite name, looking at Kira across the crowded tavern. She met his gaze, held it. Something passed between them in that moment. Some acknowledgement, some understanding. She saw him, really saw him. Not as the janitor, not as the poor human, as Callum Wright, as a man who worked with dignity when dignity was the only thing he had left. And she'd said it out loud, in front of everyone. His hands didn't shake that night. He went back to work, finished collecting the debris, wiped down the tables, swept the floors, the familiar routine. But everything felt different now. People acknowledged him when he passed, just small nods, brief eye contact, nothing dramatic. But enough to know that something had shifted, that he wasn't quite as invisible as he'd been that morning. When the tavern finally closed and Callum was doing his final sweep, Maris appeared from the kitchen. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching him work. "Come here, Wright." He set down his broom, followed her into the kitchen. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she kept warm all night, handed him one, sat down at the small wooden table where she did her prep work. "Sit." He sat. Maris was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I need to tell you something," she said finally. "Something you deserve to know." Callum waited. "I've been reporting to Chief Magnus since the day you arrived in Iron Peak." She said it plainly, matter of fact, no apology in her voice. "He asked me to keep an eye on you, tell him what kind of man you were, whether you were running from something or to something." Callum felt something settle in his chest. Not betrayal exactly, not surprise, just understanding. "I know," he said quietly. Maris raised an eyebrow. "You knew, oh, I suspected. You asked too many questions that first week, watched too closely, and you're not the curious type unless there's a reason." She almost smiled. "You're smarter than you look." "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Maris took a sip of her coffee. "That you're a good worker. That you show up early and stay late and fix things without being asked. That you treat people with respect even when they don't deserve it. That whatever you're running from it made you careful, not cruel." She paused. "I also told him about Tyler Morrison, about the fire, about why you left Denver." Callum's hands tightened on his coffee cup. "How did you—" "I have friends in Denver. Made some inquiries. Found your old partner. He told me everything. About the truck. About the 3 seconds. About how you followed protocol exactly and still ended up with a young man's death on your conscience." She leaned forward slightly. "I told Magnus you were a man who'd rather carry guilt he didn't deserve than let someone else's family suffer. That's worth knowing about a person." Callum was quiet for a long time, processing, understanding that he'd been less invisible than he thought, that his past had followed him here even as he tried to outrun it. "Does Kira know," he asked, "about Morrison?" Maris studied him. "You'd have to ask her that yourself." She stood, collected the coffee cups, went back to her stove. "For what it's worth, right, I told Magnus you were good people. Still believe that. Whatever's happening between you and the chieftain, just be honest with her. That's all I ask." Callum nodded, left the kitchen, walked home through streets that had gone quiet and cold. He lay awake that night thinking about secrets, about how nothing ever really stayed buried, about how the past had a way of catching up no matter how far you ran, but also thinking about Kira's voice saying his name, about the way she'd defended him in front of everyone, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, being seen for who he really was wasn't the terrifying thing he'd always thought it would be. His hands didn't shake. The next morning, Callum arrived at the Broken Tusk before dawn as always. But this time he wasn't alone. A young orc soldier stood by the back door. Clean uniform, respectful posture, the colors of the Stormhold clan on his shoulder. "Callum Wright." Callum's stomach dropped. "That's me. Chief Magnus Stormhold requests your presence, at your earliest convenience." The way the soldier said it made it clear that earliest convenience meant right now. Callum set down his bucket, washed his hands, put on his jacket, followed the soldier out into the morning cold. The walk to Stormhold Hall was short, maybe 15 minutes through streets just beginning to wake, smoke rising from chimneys, frost clinging to windows, the sound of boots on packed snow. Callum had never been to the hall before. He'd seen it from a distance. The largest building in Iron Peak, built from mountain stone that looked carved from the peaks themselves. Inside was warmer than expected. The smell of wood smoke and coffee and organized activity, people moving with purpose, a community in motion. The soldier led him through corridors to a large room at the back. Simple furniture, a desk covered in papers and maps, windows looking out at the mountains, and Chief Magnus Stormhold standing by the window, looking out at the peaks like he was reading something in the snow patterns. He turned when Callum entered, studied him for a long moment. Magnus was perhaps 65, maybe older. Time sat differently on orcs, but there was no mistaking the weight of years in his eyes. He was still large, still powerful, but the power had settled, become something denser and more patient than youth. His gray eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "You're the human from the broken tusk," Magnus said. Not a question. "Yes, sir. My daughter speaks well of you." Callum said nothing, waited. Magnus moved away from the window, crossed to stand in front of Callum, close enough to tower, close enough to intimidate, but his voice was level, almost gentle. "This concerns me," he said. "Not because of what you are. I've worked with humans for 40 years. Many of them are good people. Some of them are better people than most of the orcs I know." He paused. Let that sink in. "It concerns me because of what she is, because of what her life requires of her. Do you understand the difference?" "I think so," Callum said quietly. "She will lead the Stormhold clan when I'm gone." Magnus's voice was matter-of-fact, stating reality. That is not a position that accommodates certain kinds of attachment. The clan looks for reasons to doubt her. She is young. She is female in a culture that has not always valued female leadership. And she has chosen to govern through intelligence rather than force, which makes the ones who only understand force uncertain. Uncertain people are dangerous people. He studied Callum with those sharp gray eyes. A relationship with a human janitor would give them enormous ammunition. Callum held the older orc's gaze. "I understand." Something shifted in Magnus's expression. Not hostile, not kind, just serious. The expression of a man who'd spent a lifetime weighing things carefully and knew the cost of weighing them wrong. "Because I'm not here to threaten you, Callum Wright. I'm here to make sure you understand what you would be asking of her, what she would be risking, not for a night, not for a season, but for the rest of her life." The words sat heavy in the room, the truth of them undeniable. Callum thought about Kira, about the way she watched things, about the loneliness he'd recognized in her eyes because he'd seen it in his own reflection, about the weight she carried that left no room for certain kinds of lightness. He thought about Tyler Morrison, about 3 seconds of hesitation while flames consumed everything, about the way some choices echo for years after you make them. "With respect, Chief," Callum said slowly, carefully, "I think she's already decided what she's willing to risk, and I don't think either of us gets a vote on that." Magnus stared at him. The silence stretched, became something almost physical, and then slowly something shifted in the old warrior's face. Something complicated, multi-layered, impossible to fully read. He was quiet for a long time. "No," he said at last. "I don't suppose we do." He turned away, walked back to the window, looked out at the mountains. "Maris says you're a good worker, that you show up early and stay late and fix things without being asked, that you followed protocol when it mattered and still carry the weight of a death that wasn't your fault." He turned back. "She also says you're smart enough to know when you're being watched and decent enough not to hold it against her." "Maris talks too much," Callum said. Magnus almost smiled. "She does, but she's rarely wrong about people." He crossed to the door, opened it. The conversation was nearly over. "My daughter needs someone who sees her, not the chieftain, not the heir, just her. That's a rare thing in her life. Rarer than you probably understand." "I'm beginning to," Callum said. Magnus nodded. "If you heard her right, it won't be me you answer to. It'll be her. And she's far more dangerous than I ever was." "I believe that," Callum said. "Good." Magnus paused. "One more thing. She asked me not to interfere, not to summon you, not to warn you off. She said if I did, she'd never forgive me." He met Callum's eyes. "I called you here anyway, because I'm her father before I'm her chief, and I needed to see for myself what kind of man had caught her attention." "And," Callum asked quietly, "and I think maybe she sees something I'm only starting to understand." Magnus stepped aside. "You can go." Callum walked back to the broken tusk through streets that had fully woken now. Market stalls opening, people moving through morning routines, the machinery of a small mountain town grinding into motion. His hands were steady, his mind was clear. Magnus hadn't forbidden the relationship, hadn't demanded it end. He'd simply made sure Callum understood the weight of it, the reality of it, the cost that Kira would pay for choosing this. And Callum did understand. Understanding didn't make it easier, but it made it honest. That evening, Kira arrived at 7 o'clock as always, crossed to her usual table, ordered her dark wine. But this time when she looked at Callum across the crowded room, he met her gaze and held it. And something passed between them that needed no words. Your father spoke to me. I know. Are you afraid? Yes, me too. And somehow that made it real. The days following Magnus's summons were different in the way that water is different after it's been disturbed. The surface settles, yes, returns to something that looks calm, but underneath the currents have changed direction entirely. Callum arrived at 5 in the morning like always, scrubbed the floors like always, fixed what was broken and cleaned what was dirty and made the mess disappear like always. But people nodded at him now when he passed. Small acknowledgments, brief eye contact, the kind of basic human recognition that he'd been living without for 4 months. Thad and his crew still came to the tavern, still sat at their usual table near the fireplace. But the loud commentary had stopped. The deliberate mess-making had stopped. They drank their ale and ate their meals, and when Callum came to clean their table, they shifted their chairs to give him room. It wasn't respect exactly. It was something quieter than that, something closer to understanding that the rules had changed and they no longer controlled the narrative. Old Ronan raised his mug to Callum one evening. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The gesture was enough. Maris started including an extra portion with his daily meal. Never mentioned it. Just set the plate down with more food than before and went back to her cooking. Small things, quiet things, but they accumulated. Added up to something that felt almost like belonging, and Kira kept coming. 7 o'clock every evening. Like clockwork. Like gravity. The door would open and the tavern would shift, and she would cross to her usual table and order her dark wine. But now she arrived earlier sometimes. 6:30, 6. Once she came at 5:45, and the evening crowd was still filtering in, and she didn't seem to care that people noticed the change in pattern. She watched Callum work with that same steady attention, and he worked knowing she was watching, and something in the space between them grew heavier and more complicated and harder to ignore. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Callum was struggling with a heavy table near the window. One of the regulars had requested it moved to accommodate a larger group. The table was solid oak, built to last, and heavy enough that moving it alone required leverage and stubbornness, and the willingness to accept that you might not succeed. Callum had his hands braced on one end, his shoulders straining, his feet planted, pushing with everything he had. The table moved, an inch, 2 inches, and then Kira was there. She appeared at the other end of the table without a word, put her hands on the wood, met his eyes across the distance. Together they moved it. The tavern watched. Of course the tavern watched. The chieftain of Iron Peak moving furniture with the human janitor. It was the kind of image that burned itself into collective memory. The kind of thing people would talk about for years. But Kira didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. When the table was in position, she straightened, brushed her hands off, looked at Callum. Better, she said. Then she went back to her seat, picked up her wine, returned her attention to the room. Callum stood there for a moment, his hands on the table they'd moved together, his heart doing that complicated thing again. He went back to work, but the warmth in his chest stayed. The weeks became months. Winter settled over Iron Peak like a blanket. Snow piled in the streets, ice formed on the windows. The cold bit deep into the mountains and didn't let go. The pattern continued. Callum arrived at the broken tusk before dawn, scrubbed floors, fixed what broke, made the mess disappear. His hands shook when they were empty and stayed steady when they worked. Kira came every evening at 7, sat at her usual table, watched him work, and sometimes in the quiet moments between the noise they talked. Not long conversations, not dramatic declarations, just small exchanges, brief connections in the spaces where their lives overlapped. She told him about the pressure of leadership, about decisions that had no good answers, about the loneliness of being responsible for hundreds of lives and having no one to share that weight with. He told her about the fire, About Tyler Morrison screaming, about 3 seconds of hesitation, about the way guilt sits in your bones and makes a home there. She told him about her mother, dead 5 years now, how she still sometimes turned to ask her advice and felt the absence like a physical wound. He told her about his hands, about how they shook when he wasn't working, about how the only time he felt steady was when he was doing something useful. They talked while he wiped tables, while he swept floors, while the tavern bustled around them and pretended not to notice. And slowly, carefully, they built something between them that had no name, that couldn't be labeled or categorized or explained to people who didn't understand. It wasn't romance exactly, or it was romance but not the kind that led to marriage and houses and shared lives. It was two people who saw each other, really saw each other, in a world that insisted they both be invisible in different ways. She was the chieftain who carried her people's weight. He was the janitor who carried the weight of flames and screaming. And in the space between those two lonely positions, they found something that felt almost like peace. The tavern adjusted, adapted. Old Ronan still raised his mug. Maris still gave Callum extra portions. Thad and his crew drank quietly and stopped making extra mess. New people came to Iron Peak, travelers from other towns, drawn by the story that had spread through the region, growing in the telling, becoming something larger than itself. They came to see the orc chieftain and the human janitor, and what they found was a woman doing her work with precision and intelligence, and a man doing his work with quiet dignity, and the two of them existing in the same space with an ease that was more remarkable than any dramatic gesture. 3 months passed, then 4, then 5. Late winter arrived with storms that buried the town in snow. The broken tusk became a refuge from the cold, a warm place where people gathered and the fire never went out. Callum's birthday came and went quietly. He didn't mention it, didn't celebrate. Just another day of work in a string of days that had started to blur together. But Maris noticed. She always noticed. 53 today, isn't it? She said one morning, sliding his breakfast across the counter. Callum looked up surprised. How did you? I know things. It's what I do. She went back to her stove. Don't make a fuss. Just thought you should know someone noticed. That evening when Kira arrived at 7, she brought something with her, a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. She set it on the table Callum was cleaning without ceremony. What's this? Open it. Inside was a pair of gloves, well made, lined with soft wool, the kind of gloves that would keep hands warm during the cold walk home. But it was the stitching that caught his attention. Irregular, unpracticed. The work of someone who knew how to lead armies but had never learned to sew. You made these, he said quietly. Kira's expression was carefully neutral. Maris mentioned your birthday was coming and that you walk home in the cold every night. Thank you. She almost smiled. You're welcome. That night, walking home through the snow with his new gloves warm on his hands, Callum understood something fundamental. Kira Stormhold, chieftain of Iron Peak, had spent hours learning to knit so she could give him something made by her own hands. His hands didn't shake the entire walk home. 6 months after that morning, when Kira had first walked into the empty tavern and spoken his name, 6 months of watching and being watched, of small kindnesses and quiet conversations, of building something that had no blueprint and followed no rules anyone could explain. It was a cold evening in early spring when Kira arrived earlier than usual. 6 o'clock. The tavern was only half full. Callum was repairing a broken chair near the window, his tools spread out on the floor around him. She crossed to where he worked, stood there for a moment, watching. Walk with me, she said. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite a command either. Something in between. Callum set down his tools, wiped his hands on his work trousers, followed her out the front door into the cold evening air. They walked in silence through streets covered in slush, the last remnants of winter melting away, the air smelling of snow and smoke, and the promise of something warmer coming. Kira led him to the edge of town, to a place where the buildings gave way to open space and you could see the mountains clearly. The peaks still white with snow, the sky turning purple and gold with sunset. She stopped, looked out at the view. I need to tell you something, she said. Callum waited, his breath visible in the cold air. I didn't start watching you because you were interesting, Kira said. I started watching you because I already knew who you were. Something cold settled in Callum's stomach. 6 months before you arrived in Iron Peak, I received a message from a man named David Chen, your former partner in Denver. Callum's breath caught. He told me about the fire, about Tyler Morrison, about how you took the fall for following protocol while everyone around you looked for someone to blame. He told me you were leaving Denver, that you needed somewhere quiet, somewhere that wouldn't ask questions. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes steady. He asked if I could give you that, a safe place, a fresh start. He said you were one of the best men he'd ever known, and you deserve better than what Denver gave you. Callum couldn't speak, couldn't process. David had reached out, had protected him even after everything. So when you showed up at the Broken Tusk looking for work, I already knew your name, already knew your story, and I came to the tavern every night for 6 weeks to see if David was right about you. And Callum managed, and he was. Kira's voice was soft. You are exactly who he said you were, a man who works with integrity, who carries guilt he doesn't deserve, who sees people as people, not obstacles or tools. She paused. I didn't fall for you because you were mysterious, Callum. I fell for you because I knew your worst moment and watched you refuse to let it define you. The sunset painted the mountains golden red. The cold air burned Callum's lungs. And standing there on the edge of Iron Peak with Kira Stormhold beside him, he felt something break open in his chest. Not breaking in a bad way. Breaking like ice breaks in spring, like something frozen finally starting to thaw. You knew, he said, this whole time. Yes. And you still, yes. He looked at her, at the careful strength in her face, at the loneliness that mirrored his own, at the woman who'd spent 6 months watching a janitor work because she wanted to see if a good man could still be good after the world tried to break him. I don't know what this is, he said quietly, what we're doing, what this becomes. Neither do I, Kira said, but I know I'm tired of watching from across a room. I know I'm tired of pretending this is casual. I know that when I think about the future, you're in it, somehow, even if I don't know how yet. She reached out, took his hand, her fingers warm despite the cold. Is that enough? She asked. For now, Callum looked at their joined hands, at the impossible thing they were trying to build, at the future that had no guarantees and no clear path forward. Yes, he said, that's enough. They stood there as the sun set, two people who'd found each other in the unlikeliest of places, a chieftain and a janitor, power and poverty, loneliness and loneliness finally finding connection. The walk back to the tavern was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, comfortable, settled. When they reached the Broken Tusk, Kira stopped at the door. Same time tomorrow, she asked. Same time tomorrow, Callum confirmed. She smiled, small, private, just for him. Then she went inside, back to her usual table, back to her dark wine and her careful observation of the room. And Callum went back to work. Back to his bucket and his brush and his careful tending of the invisible labor that held the world together. But everything felt different now. The months continued to pass. Spring came fully, then summer. The snow melted from the peaks. The air warmed. The world turned green. The pattern remained. Callum worked. Kira watched. They talked in the quiet moments. They built something that had no name but felt increasingly real. Magnus didn't interfere. Maris kept cooking and observing and occasionally offering unsolicited advice. Old Ronan raised his mug every Thursday. Thad and his crew learned to be civil, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Iron Peak adapted to the idea that their chieftain had chosen someone unexpected, someone impossible, someone who proved that worth wasn't measured in gold or strength or birth. They didn't all approve. There were still whispers, still disapproval from the traditionalists, still questions about what it meant for the clan's future. But Kira led with the same intelligence and strength she'd always shown, and Callum worked with the same quiet dignity he'd always brought to his labor. And together they proved that some connections transcend the rules people try to impose on them. One evening in late summer, as the sun set behind the mountains and the tavern filled with its usual noise, Callum stood at the edge of the main hall with his broom in hand. He watched Kira at her table, watched her talk with one of her father's advisors, watched her command respect without demanding it, watched her be exactly who she was, powerful and intelligent and carrying weight that would have crushed lesser people. And then she looked up, found his gaze across the crowded room. and smiled. Just a small thing, just a brief acknowledgement, but it was theirs. People asked him sometimes if he was happy. He never quite knew how to answer that question. Happy seemed like the wrong word, too simple, too clean. What he was steady. His hands still shook when they were empty, still trembled when he held coffee or stood idle or let himself think too long about Tyler Morrison in 3 seconds and flames that consumed everything. But when he worked, they were steady. When he fixed what was broken and cleaned what was dirty and made the invisible labor that held the world together, his hands knew what to do. And when Kira Stormhold walked into the Broken Tusk every evening and watched him work like he was worth watching, he felt something in his chest that wasn't quite happiness, but was close enough. Purpose, maybe, or dignity, or the quiet satisfaction of being seen for exactly who he was by someone whose opinion actually mattered. The evening wore on. The noise rose and fell. The fire burned. The ale flowed. And at closing time, when everyone else had gone home and Callum was doing his final sweep of the empty tavern, Kira remained. She sat at her table, her wine long finished, just sitting. Callum finished sweeping, put away his tools, walked over to where she sat. "You don't have to stay," he said gently. "It's late." "I know." She looked up at him, "But I wanted to." He sat down across from her, his knees protesting, his back aching, 53 years old and feeling it in his bones. "6 months ago," Kira said quietly, "I watched you scrub a floor and thought about how rare it was to see someone work with real dignity, to see someone be genuinely good at something everyone else thought was beneath them." She reached across the table, took his hand. "And now 6 months later, I still watch you scrub floors, and I still think about dignity. But I also think about how grateful I am that David Chen sent you here, that you chose to stay, that you let me see you." Callum's throat was tight. "I'm grateful too." "Are you happy?" she asked. He thought about it, really thought about it. "I don't know if happy is the right word," he said slowly. "I still see Tyler's face sometimes, still hear the screaming, still carry guilt for 3 seconds that can't be taken back." He squeezed her hand. "But I also see you smile. I see Ronan nod respect. I see Maris sneak extra food onto my plate. I see a place where I matter, where the work I do matters, where I'm allowed to be exactly who I am, broken parts and all." He met her eyes. "Maybe that's not happiness. Maybe it's something better. Maybe it's peace." Kira was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, came around the table, and in the empty tavern with only the dying fire for light, she leaned down and kissed him. Gentle, brief, but real. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "Same time tomorrow," she whispered. "Same time tomorrow," he promised. She left, the door closing softly behind her. And Callum sat alone in the Broken Tusk, surrounded by clean tables and swept floors and the evidence of a day's honest work completed. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear, the mountain air turning cold. Another night settling over Iron Peak. Callum stood, collected his things, locked the doors, walked home through quiet streets. His hands were steady, and tomorrow he would come back. Would scrub the floors and wipe the tables and fix what broke and make the mess disappear. And at 7 o'clock, Kira would walk through the door, would cross to her usual table, would watch him work like it mattered, because it did matter. Not in the grand sweeping way that saving lives mattered, not in the dramatic way that leading clans mattered, but in the quiet, essential way that all honest work matters, in the way that being seen matters, in the way that choosing every day to be decent and kind and present matters. Callum Wright had been a lot of things in his 53 years. A paramedic, a man haunted by 3 seconds of hesitation and flames that wouldn't stop burning in his memory. A janitor, the poorest man in the Broken Tusk. But more than any of that, he was a man who'd learned that sometimes dignity isn't about what you've accomplished or what you've lost. Sometimes dignity is about showing up, about doing the work, about being steady when everything else shakes. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone notices, someone sees you, and that makes all the difference. His hands were steady, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.